The most important move in this encounter happened before anyone noticed it. By the time Iranian fast boats began cutting across a tanker's path in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the pressure already looked real. Small craft closing distance, a massive ship adjusting its course, a U.S. Navy destroyer holding position nearby. In one of the world's most dangerous shipping lanes, that kind of moment can spiral quickly, and for a brief stretch of water, it looked like Iran had seized the initiative. But the move that mattered most was not the one happening on the surface, because by the time the boats pressed closest, the encounter had already begun turning somewhere else. Chapter 1: Crisis Entry. The tanker was already inside the traffic lane when the first wakes cut across the water, not drifting, not wandering, moving with purpose. Gray water tightened between dark hulls and shore. The Strait of Hormuz did what it always did there. It made every course correction matter and every mistake arrive faster. Then more boats appeared. Fast, low, and hard to ignore IRGC. Craft came in from separate angles, their bows slapping the chop as they narrowed the space around the tanker. On the bridge of the merchant ship, no one needed a lecture to understand the danger. A tanker does not turn like a patrol boat. It carries its weight through the water slowly. That was the first pressure point. One Iranian boat cut closer than the rest, sliding toward a position the tanker could not dismiss. Not close enough to strike, close enough to force attention. The big ship gave a little room, not much, but enough to show the pressure was working where everyone could see it. And that was the problem. Because once a large vessel starts reacting inside a lane, this narrow, the encounter stops feeling routine and starts feeling written by whoever moved first. Off the tanker's quarter, a U.S. destroyer held its place in the picture, close enough to matter, quiet enough to look late. From the outside, that silence was dangerous. Iranian boats were pushing, the tanker was adjusting, and the warship was not yet taking over the scene. So on the surface it looked like Tehran had found the rhythm first. Small boats were dictating distance. A larger ship was forced to respect it. That was what made the moment persuasive. It did not look reckless. It looked calculated, like the beginning of an intercept designed to stay below war. But visibility can lie, because the first move anyone could see was not necessarily the first move that mattered. And as those boats pressed closer through the strait, another part of the encounter was already beginning elsewhere. Inside the destroyer, someone was no longer watching boats. Someone was starting to watch a pattern. Chapter 2: Strategic Gamble. The fast boats did not slow down. They kept cutting across the tanker's path, never staying still long enough to look easy, clean, or harmless. That was how this kind of pressure worked. In water, that tight, small boats did not need to sink anything to start taking control. They only had to change somebody else's timing. A tanker carries its danger with its own mass. It does not pivot out of trouble. It leans through it slowly, heavily, and with consequences. Every correction costs distance. Every hesitation costs space. And inside a traffic lane, space is the one thing already running short. So the pressure was never about gunfire. Not yet. It was about forcing a larger ship to think one move later than it wanted. Another Iranian boat crossed wider this time, not close enough to collide, but close enough to shape the captain's next choice. Keep course, and the margin tightens. Adjust, and the smaller boats learn they can move you. That was the leverage. The tanker started to look less like a vessel in transit, and more like a ship being managed from the outside. Not stopped, not seized, just pushed off its natural rhythm, and in a choke point that can be enough. Because once the larger vessel begins reacting to the smaller one's tempo, the encounter stops feeling balanced. It starts to feel owned. The U.S. destroyer understood that risk, which was exactly why it could not simply surge forward and crush the geometry by force. A warship that closes too fast can solve one problem and create two more. It can crowd the tanker, compress the water, and turn a pressure incident into a collision crisis. That restraint mattered. But on the surface, restraint rarely looks like control. It looks like delay. It looks like caution. And sometimes it looks like weakness. That was what made Iran's gamble believable. The fast boats were smaller, faster, and operating in a space where sharp movement mattered more than raw size. They were not trying to overpower the destroyer. They were trying to work around it, to get inside the decision cycle, to make every American response arrive half a beat late. And for a moment, it looked possible. The tanker was adjusting. The spacing was changing. The wakes were crossing tighter now, layering movement over movement. From a distance, it could pass for chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that kept returning to the same pressure points. One boat pressed closest, another widened the angle, a third lingered where a reaction might come from. That was the detail that mattered. Because repetition changes the meaning of motion. And by the time the boats made another pass, what looked like harassment on the surface was beginning to look like structure somewhere else. Chapter 3. Hidden Battlefield Picture. The boats were still pressing closer. Wakes cut across the tanker's path, again tight arcs of white water stacking movement over movement. From the outside, it still looked like pressure building. Another pass came in fast. One boat slid across the bow. Another widened the angle behind it. A third lingered where the destroyer might move. It looked messy, fast, unpredictable. But inside the destroyer's combat information center, no one was calling it chaos. They were watching repetition. Contacts shifted across the surface picture, but the same shapes kept returning. The same boat pushed closest. The same angle opened behind it. Pressure was moving in circles. That was the first clue. Because harassment does not usually repeat so cleanly. Real disorder spreads outward. This movement kept folding back on itself, and that meant something was guiding it. Another pass. The lead boat cut sharply across the tanker's line again, its wake spreading wide enough to force the merchant captain's attention. Behind it, a second craft drifted just far enough away to keep the destroyer guessing, and farther out, a third waited in open water. 3 positions, 3 jobs, 1 boat creating pressure, 1 shaping the angle of the scene, 1 watching for the response. Inside the CIC, the pattern sharpened. The boats were not swarming, they were rotating. Each pass showed the same structure again, like a formation turning slowly through the water. From above, an elevated set of eyes confirmed it. The surface picture was not random movement. It was a design repeating itself. And once a design repeats, it becomes readable. That was when the destroyer's silence stopped meaning hesitation. Because restraint was doing something pressure could not. It was letting the boats finish revealing themselves. Another run came through the lane. The lead boat pushed slightly closer than before. Not reckless, but confident enough to test the margin. Behind it, the second craft widened its track again, opening the same viewing angle, and the third boat held back right where a reacting warship might enter. The roles had not changed. That was the second clue. Because if the boats were improvising, their positions would shift with every pass. Instead, the same pieces returned to the same places. Pressure, angle, response. 3 moving parts repeating the same design. And with each repetition, the destroyer gained something the boats could not see. Not distance, understanding. By the next pass, the officers watching the screen were no longer asking what the boats were doing. They were asking something else. What did this encounter require if Iran wanted it to succeed? The answer was beginning to form. For the pressure to work, the boats needed the destroyer to react too early. To close distance fast. To break the spacing around the tanker. To collapse the water into confusion. If the warship did that, the geometry would belong to the smaller craft. But if it did not, the pattern unfolding on the water would keep giving the destroyer the same advantage every time the boats came around again. And that meant the encounter had already crossed an invisible line, because the Navy now understood exactly what Iran needed to happen next, and exactly when to stop it. Chapter 4. The reversal. The next pass came in even tighter. The lead boat cut across the lane again hard enough now to stop looking like pressure and start looking like obstruction. The water ahead of the tanker was no longer just crowded. It was being interfered with. Warnings had already been there, stacking one over another, clear enough for any crew on the water to understand what line was approaching. But the boats kept coming. That was the point where ambiguity began to lose its value. Because harassment can hide inside uncertainty. Unsafe interference cannot. Once the lead boat crossed that threshold, it stopped being protected by the confusion around it, and inside the destroyer, that was the moment the waiting ended. Not with a charge forward, not with a dramatic surge, with a move measured in angles. The warship adjusted position first, not to dominate the whole scene at once, but to take away the one geometry the small boats had been using all along. Angle denial. The destroyer moved just enough to close the pressure lane the lead craft needed without crowding the tanker or collapsing the water into panic. That changed the picture immediately. The lead boat still had speed, it still had motion, but it no longer had the same place to make that speed matter. Then came separation control. The destroyer did not chase the entire group, it did something more precise. It forced distance between the lead unit and the support pattern behind it. That mattered more than raw intimidation, because those other boats had only been dangerous together. One shaped the angle, one created the pressure, one waited for the reaction. Break the spacing and the design stops functioning as a design. Now the tanker held the lane. That was the clearest sign the encounter had started to change hands. The larger ship was no longer drifting into someone else's rhythm. It was being kept in its corridor, and the lead craft could feel it. Another attempt came in, another burst of acceleration, another try to regain the same leverage, but the angle was gone now. The destroyer had taken away the approach that made the pressure persuasive. The support boats were still moving, but not from positions that carried the same weight. That was the reversal. Not because Iran stopped moving, the boats were still there, still fast, still capable of looking aggressive. But aggression and control are not the same thing. A minute earlier, the smaller craft had been shaping choices. Now they were reacting to a picture they no longer authored. Every move they made after that cost them more than it cost the ship. Push again and they confirmed the obstruction. Widen out and they surrendered the close pressure that made the intercept feel credible. Try to regroup and they exposed just how dependent the whole encounter had been on one lead position. That was why the moment felt so quiet. No explosion marked it. No cinematic break in the action. Just a shift in who was deciding what the next seconds would mean. And once that changed, the rest of the encounter changed with it. Because the pressure had stopped writing the scene. The boats could still maneuver, but now each maneuver narrowed their options instead of narrowing the tankers. Chapter 5. Strategic Consequence. The tanker kept moving. Its bow stayed inside the narrow traffic lane cutting forward through the gray water exactly where it had intended to go. Around it, the fast boats were still there. Their engines still roared. Their wakes still crossed the surface. They still had speed. But the encounter had changed. The lead boat no longer owned the angle that had made the pressure believable. Each time it tried to slide back toward the lane, the geometry closed before it could finish the move. The destroyer did not rush forward. It did not chase. It simply held the space that mattered most. And that was enough. Because once the tanker stayed inside the lane, the logic of the encounter flipped. The boats could still appear aggressive. But aggression without leverage is only motion. The ambiguity that had protected them was gone now. Earlier, their closeness had looked like intimidation. Now it looked like interference. Push closer and the responsibility became theirs. Pull away and the pressure that shaped the moment vanished. Either choice cost them something. And timing the one advantage they had tried to seize was no longer theirs to control. The destroyer had not silenced the boats. It had done something more decisive. It had taken control of what their movement meant. That was the strategic mistake. Because Iran had assumed the intercept would begin with proximity, with speed, with the visual shock of small craft cutting close to a much larger ship, but the encounter had not begun there. By the time the boats looked most dangerous, the critical part of the contest had already taken place somewhere quieter. It had happened when the pattern became clear, when the destroyer understood how the pressure actually worked. From that moment forward, every maneuver by the boats revealed more than it threatened. Every pass gave away structure. Every attempt to push closer confirmed the design behind the pressure. And once that design was understood, the rest of the encounter could only move in one direction. The boats could still circle, they could still accelerate across the water, but they were no longer deciding the rhythm. The decisive move had already happened long before the closest approach, long before the moment that looked most dangerous. The U.S. Navy had already won the encounter before Iran knew the intercept had truly begun. At the start, it looked simple. Iran moved first. Fast boats cut across a narrow waterway and a tanker slowed inside the tight lanes of Hormuz. On the surface, the pressure was obvious, but the truth of the encounter was quieter than that. The boats believed the intercept began when they closed the distance. In reality, it began the moment their pattern became readable. From that point forward, every pass revealed more than it threatened. What looked like initiative was only movement. What looked like restraint was control. By the time the encounter appeared most dangerous, the decisive moment had already passed. The destroyer did not need to dominate the water, it only needed to understand it first. And when the wakes finally widened and the pressure faded, the Gulf looked calm again. A tanker still moving inside its lane, a destroyer holding steady in the dark water, and an intercept that had been decided long before the closest approach.